give everyone a little bit of perspective or background about me. Right now I'm working on a startup here in Austin as Buzz Tools. We're early stage at this point. And this is a platform for building buzz through social media. But I worked for a SaaS company here in Austin for a couple years, managing a team of half a dozen PHP developers. And before that, I ran a web development company for about 15 years. We were a PHP shop as well. I've been doing PHP for a while. Before that, I was doing C and C++. So I've been coding for a while. And PHP kind of have a love-hate relationship with. But security is one of those aspects that I really focus on. It doesn't seem to be as high a priority maybe with some other PHP developers, but it's something that I've, over the longer term, focused on. I've worked a lot with PCI, payment processing, areas where security really is important. What I'm going to be talking about tonight are PHP traits. How many people are familiar with PHP traits? Okay. How many have used PHP traits? All right. And has anyone used PHP traits in a particularly novel kind of way? Yes? No? Kind of as a replacement for, like, inheritance? Yes? Pretty much? Okay. So tonight, I'll just give a, since it looks like most of you are at least familiar with traits, I'm not going to focus too much on explaining what traits are. They're a set of methods used across multiple classes. They reduce limitations. PHP is a single inheritance language. There are frameworks that help you get around that. Traits were introduced in PHP 5.4. So your really basic trait here, we've got at the top our simple trait, which introduces the function, and any class where we use this trait, it's essentially as if we had declared this method within that particular class. I assume this is straightforward for everyone. If you have any questions along the way, please go ahead and stop me.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is the word trait, is that something that translates to other languages? Or
It is actually, yes. So there are traits in other languages. Java has traits, and other languages have, I believe Scala has mix-ins, I believe it's called. So other languages do have their variant of traits. This is not something unique or distinct to PHP.
In Java, it's called traits.
I believe it is called traits in Java. Okay. Standard use case scenario here. You may have multiple classes, and each of those classes do specific things, but you've got something, in this case, it's converting a temperature into Celsius. So there's really no need across multiple classes to create a new method to convert temperature to Celsius. So you can use a trait here to do this, and then share that trait across all your classes, not worry about any dependencies. It keeps things really simple. So in the process of kind of researching the pros and cons of traits, here are some of the reasons why people say traits are bad. Potential namespace conflicts. You have to be very careful about how you name your traits. Traits are designed to be used across multiple classes. So by their very nature, because you may be using that trait in 5, 6, 7 or more classes, there's a much better chance that you're going to have a namespace conflict with some other method in any one of these classes that you're using those traits within. So obviously trait changes alter multiple classes, and sometimes that can have unexpected consequences. If you're not keeping careful track of all the various classes that use that trait, you may find when you make some seemingly trivial change to a trait that you've unknowingly impacted, some class somewhere in your code base. And finally, the fact that the method some of these methods, the methods used in the trait, are not inside the class itself. So why traits are good? Avoids the diamond problem. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. I'm not a computer scientist. This does have to do with where you have multiple inheritance if you're using a framework that brings that functionality. is a simpler way to have multiple inheritance. You don't have to worry about various dependencies. Basically, you're just pulling that trait into your class. And finally, the thing that I ran across online is that no one has really come up with a compelling use case scenario for traits. And so that's what I'd like to present tonight, a unique way that you can look at traits, something new that traits bring to the table. And from my perspective, it's useful because it introduces a new way to secure your PHP code. And in the process of introducing this, what I'll show you as well is that it introduces a way to simplify your code. If everyone's familiar with traits, I assume you're familiar with magic methods as well? Yes? Okay, anyone not familiar with magic methods inside PHP? Okay, so tonight I'm going to be focusing on, actually there's three, but these are the key ones here. Call and call static. Essentially these do the same thing. The only difference is whether the class that you're using is a static class or not. All right, so both of these magic methods, I don't know, you may not be familiar with what these particular magic methods do, but essentially these are called when a particular method doesn't exist. So if you try to call some method within a class and PHP can't identify that method, either it's not in scope for the caller or that method doesn't exist, if you've declared a call magic method, it will pass that call onto this method that you've declared. So there's a few ways that you can make a method that's inaccessible. Obviously, you can declare it privately within a class. So from PHP's perspective, that method doesn't exist outside the class. And you could also call a method, for example, that's a derivative of some name within a method in your class. And that would pass it through this call magic method as well. So let's start by building a new trait. And what we're doing here, or what I've done here, and this is code that's been used in production, it's been unit tested, the code is proven it works. You may take this general idea and do something completely different, something completely novel. Basically what I'm presenting tonight is a skeleton, not a framework in the PHP framework, but kind of a skeleton of what you might do with this class to either improve security within your code base or to simplify your code base. Can everyone see that okay?
I have to strain a little bit, but I can see it.
All right. So what I've put, and I have put these slides on SlideShare. I've got the URL at the very end of the presentation. I'm going to have to go back and look to make sure that nothing got cut off. There was some formatting issues when I loaded it up on the Mac. But a lot of this, a lot of the concepts here, and it's right here at the very top on the left, is presented at this Garfield Tech, this reference here up at the top. This developer is not using traits to do what he's doing. He's doing it without traits, so it's a little bit more cumbersome. What traits really allows us to do is do this in a really nice way. So the trait name here I'm calling permissions trait. You can name it whatever you want to. And we've got a few so this trait itself has a few variables defined here: feature context, feature ACL. Some of these are generally references. So the idea here is within your code base, your code is doing various things. And this introduces the idea that your code base or your application has various features. Okay? So a feature might be that you post to a blog, for example, or a feature may be that you send some code off to a payment gateway to process a payment. And so any feature is comprised of one or more classes, and one or more methods within that class. So what this feature context, or actually feature ACL, is really just a simple associative array, mapping what methods and classes comprise each feature within your application. Is that clear so far? I'm using the magic method toString here, bottom of the left-hand side. And what this allows you to do is just basically call your, so I can do echo and the name of my class, and whatever, if I've declared a toString magic method, it'll pass that on to the toString magic method. I chose toString magic method with the assumption that this is going to be a fairly distinct, fairly unusual magic method to use, that it's unlikely that you're using toString somewhere in your code. If you are, you might have to take a different approach. But what this does, what this quickly allows you to do is determine whether or not within your code base the code itself has access to this particular feature, or this particular, in this case it's this particular class. Moving up to the top right, we've got our caller magic method. And what's happening is that the caller magic method, when you call a piece of code that's using this trait, is it passes it through the caller magic method, and then this checks our associative array to determine whether or not the user has access to execute a particular method within a particular class. And this is a class that actually does that checking. Okay, we've got whether it's an allowed feature. Our feature list array is where we've made our associative list of what features are available for the application. In this case, it's what features are available to the application within a particular context. So it's not the application in any context, it's the application in its current running context. So if you're running as an administrative user, that application has a different context than if you're running as a lowest privileged user. There's obviously different features that are available to your administrative users than there are maybe to a guest user, for example. If you're doing something like a CMS, where you've got different classes of users and those groups of users do different things, you can break it up that way. In this case, we had a more complex application where you had essentially your groups of users, the way you might think about it, editors, reviewers, administrators, but we also had additional features that are available on a per user basis. Okay, so if you're selling an application, if you've got a SaaS application, you may charge some premium to tack on certain features to that application. All right, so maybe your base user has a set of 10 features that they can access, and then they can kind of a la carte purchase additional features. This can be used for that particular scenario as well. So it's not limited to fixed group of users. And we've essentially got three magic methods that we declare within this class: allowed feature, allowed class, allowed method. And basically the way you can think of this is that it falls through each of these steps. Okay, so first it's going to check to see if a particular feature is allowed to run. Next it's going to check to see whether or not the class is allowed to be accessed. And finally it's going to finish out by checking to make sure that that particular method can in fact be executed. And the point here is that we're relying on PHP itself to enforce our security. So unless we explicitly give our application permission for a particular user to access some method within our code base, PHP is going to die. Okay? We can use a toString magic method to make sure beforehand so that our application dies gracefully. Okay? But this ensures that if some user manages to compromise the application itself, they don't have any, they're not going to be able to escalate the privilege of their user. So you're never going to have a case where a non-privileged user gains access to administrative functionality within your application. Because what's going to happen is PHP is going to die because it can't actually, the functions that hacker in this case is trying to access aren't available within the scope of the application. So the idea here is to really, at the end of the day, once you've got your, and this is a pretty streamlined, it's really designed to be as elegant as possible, keep it as simple as possible, the code itself. And now everything really comes down to how you configure this. So on the left-hand side, what I've got is your associative feature list array. The idea is that this would be tracked within your code base. It would be a configuration file within your code base. And as developers added features to your application, they would either add to, remove from, add additional entries to this associative feature list that you're maintaining. And ultimately, what it allows you to do is that if at any point in your development cycle you have any questions about what classes or methods are being used to execute any given feature, you can actually come back to this configuration file, and it's right here. The advantage of tracking this as a file with your application is that it tracks with the history of the application as well. Theoretically, you can put this in a database, but then you don't have a direct linkage between the code in your code base and the features that are being declared. So on the right-hand side, and this is really for simplicity, but this is really, the idea here is that you would put the features that are associated with particular groups of users within your application. You would store that in a database. So within your database, you would say, administrative users have access to these specific features. And in this case, we've got the features that are accessible to the group. We've got the features that are accessible to the user. So you may have, even though you may have a user group that only typically has 10 features, you've added some additional feature for a given user. This allows you on a per user basis to add some additional privileges to the application for that particular user. And then finally, I am paranoid. I don't trust PHP. And over the years, PHP has performed in unexpected kinds of ways. So again, maybe this isn't absolutely necessary, but I'm unsetting the original feature maps that we set up here. Basically, what we're doing is we're computing the intersection between the features that the group has and the features that the user has to ensure that a developer cannot, within the code base or within the database, assign some privilege to a particular user that doesn't belong to that particular user group type. All right, so once we've got that defined, this is just a really basic secure class here. We've got 3 methods doing really simple arithmetic operations, addition, subtraction, multiplication. And back here in our configuration, here on the left-hand side, we've got feature 1, feature 2. Obviously, these are just dummy hypothetical scenarios. But in this case, feature 1 is comprised of method 1 and method 2 within the secured class class itself. And then feature 2 is method 1 and method 3. All right? And so the nice thing here is that within your application, you've created this permissions layer. And you're looking at your application and saying, okay, I don't want some of these really basic methods within my application to have to run through all this permission overhead. Okay? So I want some really basic, low-level functions, features that aren't required to run through the security, no problem. You just don't use this permissions trait. Okay? The nice thing here is that any class that where you do use the permission trait, you can ensure that code can never be executed unless it's specifically assigned to a particular user. And the way you do this is actually, and some people may have a problem with this, is that every method within a class that you wish to secure has to be declared private. The reason why is that if it's not declared private, if it's public, obviously that function can be accessed from outside your class. It's never going to pass through the PHP call or magic method. Okay? And one convention here that we adopted in this case was a way to preserve the private method. So a way that you couldn't use your call or magic method to bypass PHP security and execute a method that you truly intended to be private. You truly intended not to be accessible from outside of that class. And the way we did that was with an underscore convention in front of the method name itself. So basically, the way this works is that if your call or magic method sees that you just called a method preceded by an underscore, it kicks it back. It doesn't execute. So you still have the private scope that you're familiar with. You've got a way to achieve that. But again, in order to use the security here, you do have to declare all of the methods as being private. All right, that's it. Okay. Okay, so the way that this looks in practice, we've got our secure functions equal our new secured class. We call method 2. And in this case, based on the code, and you can do this any way you want to. In the code example that I gave, an exception will be thrown here because this particular user doesn't have access to this particular method. Method 1 and method 3, for the feature level that this user has access to, would be allowed to execute. So, this might seem really obvious, maybe doesn't seem so obvious, maybe isn't obvious how all the pieces interconnect. This started as a much larger code base until we really winnowed it down to what the essential components were. I like to design code as simple as possible, make it as universal as possible, so if there's a problem, it's relatively easy to diagnose where that problem is, especially if it's going to be something as pervasive as a security layer that's prevalent throughout your application. So what we get in the process is the ability to lock down our code execution to a per user level. All right? If you've got some methods in your application that haven't been used for the past 5 years, it's corrupting your application. A lot of times this happens, but you're scared to get rid of that because you don't know whether it might be needed at some point in the future. You're not sure that it's not needed anywhere within your application. Maybe you've got a cron job or something somewhere that you're not aware of that's still using some of that legacy functionality. But by assigning classes and methods in this way, in this configuration kind of way, we've got a really nice way of tracking what features in the application are being used, what classes and methods in the application are being used, and then we'll know, we can really easily determine which classes and methods we don't need anymore, we can throw away. And if we want to keep them around, it's perfectly fine too, because they can never be executed by our application anyway. If we decide down the road that we need them, simply enough, we just update our configuration file. one of the things that you get here is the ability, if you want, to track every class and method call in your application. So with the caller magic method, if you decide to, if you want to add the ability to really analyze your application, it's easy enough within the caller magic method to add code that's going to track exactly what methods are being called in your application. You can time how long it's taken for those various calls. What this also gets you is the ability to track what features your users are actually using within the application itself. So it gives you some inside view of, analytical view of what people are actually doing with your application. And finally, we've got the self-documenting functionality, which is because you're tracking these features within your configuration cloud. So some things here to point out is that, so one of the early negatives associated, that I presented here associated with traits, was that because they're used across multiple classes, you have potential namespace issues. All right. Here, we were really careful to try to use methods that were not commonly used. Okay. Within a normal application, I mean, I don't know. Do any of y'all use the call magic method in your application?
Occasionally, yes.
Occasionally, okay.
Magento uses it a lot.
Got it. Okay. Realistically, I don't know that you would want to take a huge framework, all right, especially like Magento, and try to graft something like this on top of a monolithic framework. All right. However, because we're choosing classes or methods here that shouldn't generally be commonly declared within the application itself, we're pretty, we can feel pretty good about not having namespace violations. And then you may recall one of the pieces of code was an additional tertiary class that we're using for within our trait. And that helps us avoid namespace conflicts as well. But if you're using traits within your application, obviously namespace conflicts is something to keep in mind. You can address that by really using long method names that are less likely to have conflicts with your other classes. And in addition to a use case scenario for using traits, we're also effectively using magic methods at the same time. So one of the things I had said to begin with is that I really value security. If you're less concerned about the security of your application and looking at this particular approach from that perspective where you're less concerned about security, this can actually bring some other advantages to your application, okay, beyond security. One of those advantages is that within your code base, instead of having separate calls that execute differently, if this user is this type, do this. If this user is this type, do this. We can actually have logic blocks within the application, okay, that only execute if the user has access to a given feature. So we can say if this particular feature is accessible, then we execute this code base. And what this does is takes all of our logic in terms of conditionally executing code within our application and moves it out to our database where we can track what features a given user should be able to access. Okay? So it simplifies a potential conditional logic within your application, and you've taken the conditional logic associated with what features a particular user should have entirely out of your code base. It's no longer in the code base at all. It's now within your database, and it's your all you're doing now is tracking what features a particular user has access to. And now the application itself is simply responsible for checking to see whether or not the application has access to a given feature. And then you control the feature access externally from the application itself. That was a really big problem within the legacy application that I was in charge of, where we were implementing this. All right, if you need it, this provides the detailed logging capabilities. And if you're looking for something really especially exotic, you could have dynamically generated methods. So to give you an idea of what that means is that rather than having a method, for example, that writes out, let's say, some entry to a database, okay? I may have a different way to write that entry to the database depending upon what user type that is, okay? Now, instead of doing some conditional kind of logic within my application, if the user is administrative, then execute this particular database logic. If the user is, a contributor, execute this particular database logic. I could potentially set this up in a way that my caller magic method might append to the method name itself the user class, okay, that's being called within the application. So for example, I might have database write underscore admin, database write underscore contributor, database write underscore editor, just as kind of an abstract example, okay? And then the caller magic method would be responsible for directing it to the proper method based on the user type. And then within my code base, within the code itself, I would declare each of those methods. And then that would entirely eliminate any logic related to what particular method gets called based on the user permissions. Does that make sense? I can have so I could potentially have 5 or 10 variants of a particular function based on what permissions a user has. Okay? One of the things I didn't cover here is that if you have namespace conflicts within traits, there is a way to address that within PHP instead of and as. This is something that I never ran across in using traits. It was never an issue. But if you do run across this namespace conflict, PHP does have a way of handling that as well. That's it. The slides are available here at the bottom at this URL. I'll take a look tonight to make sure that none of this code is being cut off from the screen. And again, you can also visit this third-party URL to see how they're doing things, to kind of give you an introduction to the whole idea in general. Does anyone have any questions? Was that reasonably clear? Yes?